Section 1 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 3 of 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Alistair. Imperialism and World Politics, Part 3 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. Chapter 13a, Imperialism in Southern Asia, Part 1. Subsection, From Chartered Company to Empire.
In India,
said Theodore Roosevelt,
we encounter the most colossal example history affords of the successful administration by men of European blood in a thickly populated region in another continent. It is a greater feat than was performed under the Roman Empire. Successful administration of the Indian Empire has been one of the most notable and most admirable achievements of the white race during the past 2 centuries.
Set this statement against the words of Mohandas Gandhi, the Holy One who led India in passive resistance to British rule in 1920 through 22. I came reluctantly to the conclusion that the British connection had made India more helpless than she ever was before. Politically and economically, the government established by law in British India is carried on for this exploitation of the masses. No sophistry, no jugglery in figures can explain away the evidence, the skeletons, in many villages present to the naked eye. I have no doubt whatsoever that both England and the town dwellers of India will have to answer, if there is a God above, for this crime against humanity, which is perhaps unequalled in history. Colossal achievement, or unequalled crime, or perchance both achievement and crime, British rule in India is unquestionably the foremost example of modern imperialism. When Indian patriots question the benevolence of British rule, or when British statesmen feelingly speak of England's benefits to India, there is a danger of forgetting that the reason why the British first entered India, and the primary reason they have remained there, was not to benefit India, but to benefit Great Britain. It may indeed be true, as an eminent British scholar asserts, that the Emperor of India is the only sovereign known to history who does not draw 1 penny from the pockets of his subjects. But it is irrelevant. The plain historical fact is that British rule in India was established for the purposes of commerce. The social and educational and political reforms which England has accomplished in India, the patriotic pride which Englishmen have learned to take in their great Asiatic empire, important as they are, nevertheless are byproducts of commercial imperialism. It was a commercial company, the East India Company, that first established British authority in a part of India. Commerce was the original purpose. Unto it were added, later, sentimental and humanitarian motives. How immense are the British business interests in India, and how rapidly they have grown in the last half-century, may well be emphasized at the very outset. Take first the capital invested. Though the precise amount cannot be stated, some rough estimates can be made. The public debt, that is, government bonds of India, much of which is held by British investors, amounts to $3.5 billion. The 634 foreign, chiefly British companies doing business in India have a paid-up capital of $2.5 billion. Of the 5,194 companies incorporated in India, with a total capital of $1 billion, a considerable portion are British-owned, and in addition there are unincorporated investments. Footnote: Sir George Paish estimated British pre-war investments in India at £379 million sterling, or $1,895 million. This, however, does not include the important item of British companies doing business with India. End footnote. Add trade. Great Britain sells to India each year goods worth about $500 million, a tenth of her total exports, and buys from India 2/5 billion dollars, worth a ninth of her total imports. The importance of India, however, is even greater to certain powerful and well-organized industries than to British industry as a whole. No industries are more influential in British politics than cotton and iron, and both of these are supremely interested in India, for about 1/5 of their exports goes to India. India, in other words, means about $225 million a year to the British cotton manufacturers. To the iron and steel industry with the allied manufacturers of machinery, railway rolling stock, and automobiles, it means $100 million. Nor should we forget the interests of British importers. It may be a bit surprising to learn that tea is India's greatest export to Britain, that this item alone runs to $120 million a year. Nor should one forget the millions of pounds sterling represented by British imports of Indian jute, raw cotton, flax seeds, gums, wool and leather. India has a mineral wealth too, which is just beginning to be exploited on any large scale. Some of the minerals found in India may appear insignificant when one looks at the tables of commerce, but because they are rare, their industrial importance is great. Such are chromite, tungsten and monazite. Of iron, India has a modest supply, almost untouched. Of coal, she produced only 8 million tonnes in 1905, but 20 million in 1923. The increase is typical. We have said that the British economic interest in India has grown with rapidity. The point is worth reiteration, because it helps explain the intensification of British political interest. India's imports increased almost 500% in the period from 1875 to 1913. Her exports, 350%. British investments in India are almost entirely the product of the last half-century. To labour the point with statistics is probably unnecessary, besides being fatiguing, but to appreciate the fact in interpreting political events we are about to relate, it is imperatively necessary. Before the 19th century, England had but a slight hold on India. Only a few provinces were actually administered by the East India Company. The greater part of the country was ruled by native princes, some of whom were puppets of the company, in the sense that they knew that they would be deposed by the company's Indian soldiers if they dared attack the company or its commerce. But the native states had not yet felt the heavy hand of foreign interference in ordinary matters of government. Abuses and indiscretions in the company's administration had led the British Parliament to extend a certain amount of control over the company's affairs. A cabinet minister and board of control in London, and in India, a governor-general appointed by the British cabinet, supervised the company's governmental activity. Such a situation could hardly be permanent. The company, having conquered a part of India, found itself impelled to conquer more. Did a native prince turn enemy, his land must be conquered and annexed. Did a king on the border of British territory interfere with British ships, he must forfeit his kingdom. Consider, by way of specific illustration, the administration of Lord Dalhousie as Governor-General of India from 1848 to 1856. Hardly had he arrived at his post when 2 Englishmen were murdered in the Sikh kingdom of Punjab in western India, and the Sikhs arose in arms against the British. What could Dalhousie do but organise a strong army of sepoys, hired native soldiers, under British officers, with a few British troops, and subjugate the kingdom, and annex it, and thereby earn for himself a step higher in the peerage, from Earl to Marquis? Or when the King of Burma, to the east of British India, insulted the British flag by stopping British merchant vessels, could Dalhousie do otherwise than punish such insolence and annex part of Burma? Footnote: the actual outbreak of the war occurred more by accident than by design. In the words of Vincent A. Smith, Oxford History of India, page 702. Commodore Lambert, sent to ask for redress for the British merchants, seized one of the Burmese king's ships, whereupon the Burmese opened fire, naturally, and the war began. End footnote. And when a handful of scattered strangers, to use Dalhousie's description of the British in India at that time, have to undertake such military expeditions, first to the west, then to the east, to countries 1,500 miles or more apart, it was the most natural thing in the world for an energetic, high-spirited governor like Dalhousie to conclude that the possessions of the company ought to be consolidated by telegraph, road, and railway communications, and that the native states which separated the company's territories ought to be brought under the company's power. To this end Dalhousie practised what he called the policy of lapse, namely, whenever a Hindu ruler died without direct male heir, his kingdom should be annexed. During his short term of office, 8 such cases occurred. Such annexations could not fail to provoke fear and hatred among the Indian princes, and the steam locomotives, monsters in the eyes of the natives, and the telegraph, both introduced during Dalhousie's reign, as well as his attempts to establish an educational system under British auspices, angered the masses. Fear that the government intended to Christianize India was a part of the general reaction against Europeanization. Moreover, the sepoys, or native soldiers, employed by the company had many reasons for discontent, including the fact that they had to bite off the ends of cartridges which they believed were greased with the fat of cows, sacred to Hindus, and pigs, forbidden to Muslims. The sepoys mutinied in 1857, and from Bengal in the east, rebellion spread like wildfire up the Ganges Valley. The Sepoy Mutiny, as the rebellion is called, was crushed at a terrible cost of life. The leaders were punished, some of them being blown to bits from the mouths of cannon. The native emperor was deposed, and his sons and grandson shot. This tragic event made it clear to British statesmen that the administration of India by the company must end. Great Britain must assume direct control. India had outgrown the company. As a matter of fact, the growth of the company's territorial possessions in India had been paralleled by a gradual extension of the London government's control over the company. But now, on the morrow of the mutiny, the company's administration of India was taken over entirely by the British government. By the Act for the Better Government of India, 1858, the company's powers were transferred to the Crown. India was to be governed by a viceroy appointed by the British Cabinet, under the supervision of a member of the Cabinet, the Secretary of State for India, and an advisory council. The company's army was merged with the British Army. The British nation became sovereign of India. Not all of India as yet. British India was then less than half of what we call India today. There were still hundreds of native states, some large, some small, some subservient to British authority, some independent enough. Though after the mutiny the doctrine of lapse was dropped, British India continued to expand at the expense of native India and border states, as the following figures show. Area annexed from 1861 to 1871, 4,000 square miles. Area annexed from 1871 to 1881, 15,000 square miles. Area annexed from 1881 to 1891, 90,000 square miles. Area annexed from 1891 to 1901, 133,000 square miles. Since 1901, the extension of British power has taken another direction, the gradual tightening of the reins by which the British Governor-General controls the 700 states which still have native rulers. The Maharajas, Rajas, Nizams, and other native sovereigns now rule not by the grace of God, but by the grace of England. Indeed, the British have found them such convenient instruments of government that their autocratic powers today may be said to rest on British support. The transition from a chartered company's commercial enterprise to a nation's avowed imperialism was more and more definitely recognised as British authority was extended, and, let us not forget, as British economic interests were magnified by the impetus which steamboats, steam locomotives, and steam engines gave to commerce and industry. In 1858, Britain had assumed direct control. In 1876, Disraeli, morning star of the dawning imperialist age, persuaded Parliament to confer on Queen Victoria the title Empress of India as an advertisement of the fact that
the Queen of England has become the sovereign of the most powerful of Oriental states.
The sequel came in 1911, when King George and Queen Mary visited India to be crowned with Oriental pomp as Emperor and Empress at Delhi, the ancient imperial capital, whither the headquarters of the British administration were moved from Calcutta. The dazzling magnificence of the coronation Durbar, reception of the ruling princes of India, was intended to impress India with the fact that England assumed the sovereignty of the former Mughal emperors whose throne had been at Delhi. That Great Britain, traditional home of parliamentary government and political liberty, should revive in India the outward show of a defunct Oriental despotism probably seemed incongruous to the few who witnessed that historic scene at Delhi in 1911. If in India one finds modern imperialism displayed more openly and dominant over a larger mass of humanity, and actuated by greater economic interests than in any other part of the world, one finds in India also the reaction to imperialism in greater intensity than elsewhere. Nowhere can one find a more interesting experiment demonstrating the effects of the mastery of the West over the East. Subsection: Indian nationalism and British reforms. One of the effects is nationalism. An Englishman has said, "This is the first and most essential thing to learn about India, that there is not and never was an India, or even any country of India, possessing, according to European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social, or religious. No Indian nation, no people of India, of which we hear so much." He is profoundly right and profoundly wrong. Right in that it is true that India has no unquestionable geographic unity, few nations have, in that the Indian people are divided in race, language, religion, and loyalty. There are in central India wild and primitive tribes, utterly different in race and language from the bulk of the Indian population. There are descendants of Arab and Afghan and Mongol and Persian invaders. There are Dravidians in the south, and there are Aryan Hindus, who, together with the great mass of mixed descent, constitute the Hindu majority of the population. No national language binds the diverse elements together. Hindi is spoken by almost a third of the population, Bengali by 1/6, and by lesser numbers dozens of other tongues are used. It is hard, very hard, to form a nation out of such discordant elements. There is an even greater difficulty created by religion. To be sure, the core of India is Hindu. The 217 million Hindus form a majority in most of the provinces, and 2/3 of the total population. But on the outskirts of India, there are 11 million Buddhists in Burma, 3 million Sikhs in Punjab, 25 million Muslims in eastern Bengal, and 11 millions in Punjab. Worse, there are millions of Muslims scattered all through India, traditionally hostile to the Hindus, into whose midst they originally came as conquerors, to remain in some states as rulers, in others as oppressed minorities. In all, there are about 70 million Muslims. Still worse, the Hindus themselves are divided into castes. Originally, perhaps, the higher castes were the conquerors and priests, the lower castes the conquered and lowly. Today the castes are social classes, within which each person is bound by religion to live and marry. At the bottom of the social scale are millions of outcasts, to touch whom would contaminate a proud Brahmin. That such divergent elements should have been fused in an ardent nationalism would be inconceivable were it not for British imperialism. Britain has made India a nation, partly by giving political unity to the great peninsula which had been a welter of warring principalities, partly by giving English education to Indians of the upper class, who thereby imbibed the European idea of nationalism, but most of all by giving India a universal sentiment which could serve as a bond of union. That sentiment is antagonism toward British rule. Perhaps no other could have brought Brahmin and pariah, Hindu and Muslim, Marathi and Bengali together, but they have been welded together in the heat of resentment against what they consider as the wrongs done to them by England. The nationalist torrent which has raged in India of recent years is a flood swelled by innumerable rivulets of discontent, but its main current has been the desire for Swarajya, self-government. Indian youths, mostly of the higher castes and wealthier classes, having studied at English universities, returning to India found much to criticise in the British administration. Here and there local associations were formed to agitate for reform. At length, in 1885, was held the first meeting of the Indian National Congress, neither national, since it included only upper-class Hindus, nor a congress, since it was composed of delegates without authority and without mandate from the people. It was simply a gathering of those Hindus who felt new impulse toward unity and self-government. It began by asking Great Britain to appoint a commission to investigate the administration of India. Little by little it grew bolder in its criticism and more representative in its composition, until it could claim to voice the aspirations of Hindu India, disregarding, of course, the lower classes. For years, the chief figure in the National Congress was G.K. Gokhale, a Hindu who, with a temperate but determined spirit, fought for the gradual emancipation of India. Long after the Hindus had become aroused, the 60 million Mohammedans of India remained inert and inarticulate, for they seemed to be a minority which could hardly join forces with the Hindu nationalists, nor claim separate nationality for themselves. But in due time the Mohammedans bestirred themselves and in 1912 founded a Muslim League, which held annual meetings like those of the National Congress, and like the Congress, criticised British despotism. The two movements were brought into alliance in 1916 during the Great War, which indirectly gave tremendous impetus to the demand for self-government in India, as in every other subject country. In 1916, the two organisations agreed to make a joint demand for representative government, in 1918 for complete self-government to be achieved by degrees within the next 15 years. What grievances against British rule could be strong enough to accomplish this miracle of uniting Hindu and Muslim in a nationalist movement? Perhaps we had best let one of the nationalist writers, Lajpat Rai, explain. All Indians, he asserts, will agree.
1. That the present constitution of the government of India is viciously autocratic, bureaucratic, antiquated, and unsatisfying. 2. That India has, in the past, been governed more in the interests of and by the British merchant and the British aristocrat than in the interest of her own peoples. 3. That the neglect of India's education and industries has been culpably tragic.
The indictment may be amplified. The government of India was autocratic and bureaucratic. Bureaucratic in that its routine was conducted by a staff of British officials strongly imbued with respect for custom and tradition and red tape, aloof from the natives, whom they regarded as inferior to the white man, serving in India and enduring the climate until their savings or pensions would permit honourable retirement in England. The bureaucracy was almost exclusively British, if we accept the unimportant lower positions. Of 2,501 administrative officers carrying salaries of 800 rupees, $266 a month or more, only 242, less than 10%, were held by Indians in 1913. The disappointment of brilliant young Hindus of good family, who secured educations hoping for government employment, only to find the higher offices closed to them, was a by no means insignificant cause of discontent. The government was also autocratic. From 1858 to 1908, India was governed by a viceroy, with the aid of his official staff and provincial governors, and with the advice of a council of appointed, not elected, members, chosen because of their official experience or their prominence. Though he was to a certain extent subject to the general direction of the Secretary of State for India in London, and by the British Parliament, London was several thousand miles distant, and in India the Viceroy's power was so great that he may well have been described as the most potent autocrat in the world. Autocratic the government remained until the agitation in India became serious. When the boast is made that Great Britain has given India generous but gradual reforms, and that England's purpose is to teach India the difficult Anglo-Saxon art of self-government as rapidly as India can learn, the cynic will suggest that the measures of self-government granted to India have been more in the nature of concessions in response to Indian agitation than of unwelcome lessons forced on a sluggish student. The first great reform was adopted in 1909 and is popularly known as the Morley-Minto Constitution, since it was adopted largely at the urging of Lord Morley, then Secretary of State for India, and Lord Minto, then Viceroy. It was adopted at a time when unrest was very prevalent in India. The National Congress had long been in existence. Native newspapers had sprung up all over the land and were boldly criticising the government. And there was a particular grievance. In 1905, the brilliant but high-handed Lord Curzon, then Viceroy, had cut the huge province of Bengal into two provinces, largely for reasons of administrative efficiency, hardly realising the dangers involved in the probability that the Bengalese, who might almost be said to possess a nationality of their own, would regard this as an outrageous violation of their unity, or that the Hindus of eastern Bengal would resent being included in a new province with a Muslim majority when they had previously enjoyed the position of a majority in the whole province. The division of Bengal aroused nothing short of fury. Newspapers were loud in their complaints until the Press Act of 1908 muzzled them. Bombs were mysteriously exploded and officials murdered, not by ordinary criminals, but by determined young Bengalese of good education and family. An Explosive Substances Act enabled the government to check the bomb throwing to some extent, but the populace seethed with dangerous ferment, and even the arbitrary imprisonment of political agitators availed little. Repression failing, the British used concession. It passed the Morley-Minto Constitution, and 2 years later announced that Bengal would be reunited. Even after the reform, the government of India could hardly be called other than autocratic. The law of 1909, India Councils Act, granted two important concessions. First, it permitted native Indians to be eligible for high offices in the Viceroy's Executive Council and the Executive Councils of the provincial governors. Second, it enlarged the existing legislative councils, which had hitherto been little more than advisory bodies of officials. The provincial legislative councils were to include a number of British officials, but a majority of non-official members, some of whom were to be elected by an undemocratic system of class representation. In the Legislative Council for the central administration, the officials still remained in the majority, because control of this central council seemed more important to British interests. The councils could pass resolutions, subject to the British Parliament's overriding authority. They could discuss the budget and other measures. They could criticise and suggest. They could oppose and propose, but neither depose nor dispose. They could not overthrow the administration or tighten the purse strings. They were, in short, experimental debating clubs. By moderate Indian leaders, such as Gokhale, the generous and fair nature of the reform was praised. By extreme nationalists, the reform was denounced as inadequate, and by all, it was considered unsatisfactory after a few years had passed. We may be permitted to comment that giving a subject people the right to criticise without the right to act, as England did in India and America did in the Philippines, cannot be anything but a halfway house. The right to criticise infallibly stimulates a demand for the right to act. A next step towards self-government was taken in 1919. This time it was even more clear that Great Britain acted in response to nationalist agitation. During the Great War, India remained loyal, or perhaps passive would better describe the condition. British imperialists like to point with pride to the fact that India contributed £150 million and 800,000 soldiers and 400,000 labourers for overseas service to the winning of the war. The record is remarkable, but should not be taken quite at its face value, for the soldiers were recruited from the fighting classes and races which had little in common with the educated classes of the towns, and the financial contribution was made by a British-controlled administration. Certain native princes, true it is, contributed generously, but their reason is explained by A.J. MacDonald. They realised that the maintenance of the principle of autocracy is wrapped up with the continuance of British domination. For them, the war was not to make the world safe for democracy. A Mohammedan newspaper, Hitaishi of Calcutta, contributed another surprising reason why India should support England in the war. The British Empire is known as a Muslim empire, for under no other sovereign on earth is there such a large Muslim population. But one of the chief reasons why there were relatively few attempts at revolution during the war, and why nationalist leaders such as Mohandas Gandhi urged Indians to support Britain's cause, was that the nationalists hoped that wartime loyalty would be rewarded with self-government. It was during the war that for the first time the Muslim League, and the National Congress joined in the plea for Home Rule. Their action was followed by a lively agitation led by the nationalists for self-government. But at the close of the war they were to be disappointed. Early in the summer of 1918 was published a report on Indian constitutional reforms, setting forth the conclusions drawn by the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, and the Secretary, Mr. Montagu, after an inquiry into Indian conditions. The Montagu-Chelmsford report admitted that the surprisingly rapid growth of Home Rule agitation in India had rendered the Morley-Minto constitution obsolete, and that further reform was needed. It was needed to prevent revolution. But the report pointed out that such reform must not be too radical. The Montagu-Chelmsford proposals were adopted by Parliament in the form of a bill, the Government of India Act, 1919. By this new constitution was established a central legislature of two houses, the Council of State with 60 members, and the Legislative Assembly with 144. And in neither house was there to be any longer a majority of British officials. The provincial legislatures were also enlarged, by including more elected members. The new legislatures were more representative than the old. Still, they were far from democratic. Only 909,603 persons out of 247 million in the British provinces were eligible to vote for the 104 elective members of the Central Legislative Assembly. The provincial legislatures were only a little less undemocratic. In Bengal, 1 person out of 47 could vote. In Madras, 1 out of 34. A very interesting feature, though not novel, is the division of the electorate into classes. For example, the Bengal Legislative Council is composed as follows. Non-Mohammedan urban, 11. Non-Mohammedan rural, 35. Mohammedan urban, 6. Mohammedan rural, 33. Landholders, 5. University, 1. European general, 5. European commerce, 11. Anglo-Indian, 2. Indian commerce, 4. For a total of 113. Thus Mohammedans and Hindus and Europeans, though they live in the same block, must vote separately, as if in different electoral districts. The scheme has its merits in affording representation to minorities, especially minorities of wealth, education, or European blood. Note the 18 seats given to Europeans and Anglo-Indians. The same sort of community or class representation applies to the Central Assembly, to which Bengal, for instance, sends 6 non-Mohammedans, 6 Mohammedans, 3 Europeans, 1 landholder, 1 representative of commerce. It is worthwhile to note that this system, not only because it applies to a people of 320 million souls, but also because it is typical of the recent tendency in European treatment of similar subject peoples. Democracy of the Occidental type, where every man and woman counts as 1 voter, regardless of wealth, education, descent, or religion, seems virtually impossible at present, where social and religious and racial differences are so deeply felt. Perhaps the most interesting feature of the Montagu-Chelmsford reform was diarchy. To satisfy the demand for responsible government, and to make the assemblies more than debating societies, the provincial councils were given control over certain transferred subjects, notably education, agriculture, public health, and others, which are to be placed in the hands of ministers chosen from among the elected members of the councils. In these departments there would be self-government, but law, order, justice, police are reserved subjects, which remained in the hands of appointed officials under the discretion of governors, uncontrolled by legislatures, in defiance of Lincoln's principle regarding the fate of a house divided against itself. The British government made it a principle to divide the administration of India. India was to be half free, half slave. Autocracy and self-government were to be twin columns supporting British imperialism. It is interesting to note the subjects which were reserved as of interest to Great Britain. The repression of disorder was a prime interest. Ingenious as it was, the scheme was by no means an unqualified success. End of section 1.